The latest tip on my blog revolves around using virtual machines and hypervisors as a development tool. So the article itself covers why you would want to do this and what all the different use cases are, at least the ones that I've encountered, and they are numerous. I recommend you check that out, but in this video, what I want to do is actually show you how it works, because I think that will really visually drive the point home for those of you that have never used a hypervisor or VMware or anything like that before. So I have here VMware Workstation. I'm running on a reasonably fast machine. I've got 8 cores and about 32 gigs of RAM, and I've got plenty of hard drive space. Now, you don't have to have that beefy a system. If you want to run this on your laptop, it certainly works. It just limits the number of VMs that you can actually run at the same time and how fast those VMs will actually run while you're using them. So let's take a look at creating a virtual machine. To do that in VMware Workstation, I just have to come up to File and then click New Virtual Machine. And it's going to walk me through a wizard. Now, the default is going to be this typical Create a Workstation 14.x virtual machine in a few easy steps. And this works fine as long as you're just going to be using the VM that you create with VMware Workstation or maybe VMware Fusion or VMware Player. But if you're going to upload this to your company's ESX server or vCenter or anything like that, you're going to want to make sure that the VM you create is compatible with the version that runs on the server. And that's usually a few steps behind Workstation. Workstation's at 14. Where I work, we have an ESX server that only supports up to version 6.5. It's a few years old. So I would have to go into custom and go through and set the actual compatibility level that I wanted. But I'm not going to do that in this case. I'm just going to stick with the default Create a Workstation 14.x. That's fine with me. Next, I need to tell it what I'm actually going to install. So what you want to do here is you want to get an ISO file for the operating system that you're going to install. And you can get those, in the case of Windows, from an MSDN subscription. Or if you're installing Linux, then you just need to go to the Linux distributions website and download the latest ISO. I've already done that. And I can go to my downloads folder. I think for this little demonstration, I will go ahead and go with Linux Mint 19, which is the latest version of Linux Mint. I'll select that. Now it's going to say it couldn't detect what operating system is in this disk image, so I'm going to have to tell it here in a minute. And this is important because later on, you're going to want to install VMware tools on your guest operating system. And those, of course, will work with very specific versions of Linux. So it knows it's Linux, it just doesn't know what flavor. And you can go through all of the different supported flavors in here and see if what you're after is here. In this case, I know that Mint is not in this list. But I also know that Mint is based heavily on Ubuntu. So I'm just going to tell it that it's Ubuntu, and it probably won't know the difference. I'll click Next. And now I just need to give it a name. I'll call it Mad Dev Skills Demo. And now I need a location. For this, I don't usually put this on my SSD, my main C drive, because space there is somewhat limited. The other gotcha that I want to point out here is this is defaulting to my Documents folder on OneDrive. So I'm about to make a 40 gig file, and that's going to be awfully large to sync up to OneDrive. So watch out for that, because in Windows it typically defaults, and in Mac too for that matter, it typically defaults to the Documents folder, and that's probably the last place you want to keep your VMs. So let's move this. I'm going to go to a large drive I have on my system. And I have a spot right here where I keep my virtual machines. So I'll create a new folder, and I'll call it MDS Demo for Mad Dev Skills Demo. I'll click off and then back on again to make sure that the name sticks. And I can see that it's going to GVM's MDS Demo. That's perfect. I'll click Next. Now I need to set the size. Now usually it gives you a default of around 20 or 30 gigs. In my experience, if you're building a VM that's going to have a lot of stuff on it, for example, if you're making a Windows VM with Visual Studio and you want to install a bunch of options, this is probably going to be a bit small. It will accommodate the installation, but when you're done, you're not going to have hardly any room left over to actually do any real work. So I usually bump this up. Now, I said a minute ago I was going to make a 40 gig file. For our demonstration, we probably don't need that, so I'm going to split the difference, and we're going to call this 30 gigs. I'll click Next, and now I can see a summary of all the options that I've selected. If I wanted to at this stage, I could come in and customize the hardware. So maybe I want to give it a little bit more RAM. Maybe we'll bump it up to 4 gigs. And maybe there's some of these things in here that we don't really care about. I'm never going to print from my VM, so I'll go ahead and remove the printer. And I will remove the sound card because I'm pretty much installing this to be used as a development machine or a web server, and those usually don't have sound cards on them anyway, so I can take that off. The other thing that you're generally going to want to fiddle with is the network adapter. By default, it uses network address translation to actually share the IP address of your host machine, which might be your laptop or your desktop computer. Better choices for this in a development environment are probably going to be either bridged or host only. Host only is only visible on this machine. It's a non-routable IP address. And the other one is bridged, and this will effectively make your virtual machine act like it were a physical machine connected to your network. It'll get its very own IP address. I'm going to go with that one. And I'm pretty happy with these settings, so I'll click Close. And finally, I'll click Finish. So it created the virtual machine for me, and I can just click this little green arrow here to power it on. In the case of Linux Mint, it's going to go ahead and load the live CD. In the case of Linux Mint, it's going to load up the live CD, and if you wanted to on a real machine or a virtual machine, you could play around with it without actually installing it. That's, of course, not what we want to do. We want to go ahead and install it. We know Linux Mint is awesome, so let's double-click our CD-ROM drive, which, remember, is pointing back to that ISO file that I downloaded. And now it's going to walk me through all of the normal installation procedures. So from here, it's pretty much the same as installing it to a physical machine. Once you get all of the basic questions answered, it's going to go ahead and install it. So installation has completed, and now it's ready to restart. So I'll go ahead and click Restart Now, and it'll reboot my virtual machine. And there you have it. We have a full installation of Linux that runs as a virtual machine. My next steps would probably be to do something like install all the security updates and then install a web server or an app server or a database or something like that so that I could really get all of those benefits that I was talking about in the blog post that's linked with this video. Well, that's it for this episode. If you like the video, hit like, hit subscribe, check out my blog at maddevskills.com, and I'll see you in the next video.